The most intense version of you isn't the one that raises its voice, breaks things, or draws attention in a dramatic way. Outbursts are easy to read, they're loud, visible, and predictable. People know how to respond to them. But there is another state of being that carries far more weight than anger ever could. The version of you that becomes still, grounded, and no longer emotionally available for chaos. This isn't about giving someone the silent treatment or using distance as a tactic to control a situation. It's something much deeper. It's a quiet mental shift where you reach a point of absolute understanding. You start to realize that not every conversation deserves your energy and not every person deserves access to your explanations. Words begin to lose their value in situations where they've already been misused or ignored too many times. When you enter what can be described as the Sophia stage, something fundamental changes within your internal world. It feels like a psychological threshold has been crossed. You stop responding to emotional traps designed to pull you into old patterns. You no longer feel the need to defend your intentions to people who have already decided to misunderstand them. And slowly you abandon the habit of softening yourself just to remain acceptable in environments that never truly valued your authenticity. This change doesn't announce itself loudly. It happens inwardly, almost silently, yet its impact is immediately noticeable in your environment. The dynamic around you shifts. People who once relied on your emotional reactions, your explanations, your empathy, your willingness to engage, start to feel a kind of withdrawal they can't quite identify. It's not hostility, it's absence of access. For a long time, your empathy may have been misinterpreted. Because you were compassionate, people assumed you were easy to override. Because you tried to understand, they assumed you wouldn't resist. Because you forgave, they believed you would forget. And because you endured, they assumed you had no limit. Over time, you likely carried emotional responsibilities that were never yours. You absorbed moods that didn't belong to you, managed tensions that weren't yours to fix, and softened consequences for people who never softened anything for you. At the time, it may have felt like strength. You may have even worn it proudly, your patience, your endurance, your ability to keep things together when others could not. But eventually, a deeper truth reveals itself. That wasn't strength in its highest form, it was adaptation. It was survival disguised as emotional maturity. Somewhere early on, you learned that staying alert to other people's emotions kept you safer than expressing your own. You became highly perceptive because you had to be. You learned to read shifts in tone, silence, and energy before they turned into conflict. That sensitivity evolved into something powerful. You became capable of understanding people quickly, sometimes before they even spoke fully. But without boundaries, that same sensitivity becomes draining. You end up using your awareness not to protect yourself, but to maintain peace for people who don't extend the same effort toward you. The Sophia stage is when that pattern breaks. Your perception doesn't disappear, it gets redirected. Instead of using your insight to manage everyone else's emotional state, you begin using it to protect your own. You start recognizing patterns with unsettling clarity. Not just the patterns in others, but the patterns in yourself. The moments where you over-explained to be accepted, where you overgave to secure stability, where you stayed too long hoping consistency would eventually arrive. You begin to see that many of your actions were not expressions of confidence, but quiet negotiations for emotional safety. And once that becomes visible, you can no longer unsee it. This is where identity shifts. You stop being someone who reacts to life and slowly become someone who studies it. There is also a form of exhaustion that arrives at this stage, but it has nothing to do with physical tiredness. It is deeper than sleep deprivation or stress. It feels like your system has reached its limit with emotional repetition. The cycles, the explanations, the misunderstandings, the disappointments, they all start to lose their relevance. Your internal energy simply stops participating in what no longer serves you. You stop arguing not because you have nothing to say, but because you finally understand that certain people are not engaging to understand. They are engaging to continue their own narrative. You stop asking for basic decency because you realize it should never have required asking in the first place. And you stop trying to prove your worth because, for the first time, you begin recognizing it without external confirmation. At this point, your presence changes. Not in a loud or confrontational way, but in a restrained, controlled one. You don't explode, you disengage. You don't create scenes, you withdraw attention. You simply stop participating in dynamics that drain you. And that kind of exit is often more powerful than any reaction. People around you feel it even if they can't explain it. Your responses become minimal but precise. Your emotional availability tightens. Where there used to be openness, there is now selectiveness. You begin to observe more than you speak, not out of fear, but out of clarity. From the perspective of empaths psychology, this is where awareness matures into sovereignty. You are no longer available for unconscious cycles. You are no longer accessible to patterns that require your self-abandonment to continue. And that quiet distance you create is what makes you psychologically untouchable. Not because you are disconnected from life, but because you are finally connected to yourself in a way that doesn't require permission. Suddenly, the same empathy that once made you easy to read becomes the reason people can no longer figure you out. You stop responding in the ways they're used to. The emotional buttons they once pressed without effort no longer produce any reaction. That confuses them, it frustrates them, and instead of reflecting, they label you as distant or cold. But it isn't coldness. It's control. It's restraint. It's the moment you choose your inner stability over other people's emotional chaos. You stop rushing in to fix every misunderstanding or smooth over every tense moment just to keep things comfortable for everyone else. You allow silence to exist without trying to fill it. You allow discomfort to sit without immediately trying to dissolve it. And in that space, people begin to reveal who they actually are, without you stepping in to soften the edges for them. In that quiet distance, a difficult realization begins to surface. You were never too sensitive. That was a convenient label placed on you by people who benefited from not handling you with care. The real issue was never your depth of feeling. It was how easily you were accessible to those who didn't deserve that level of access. There is a major difference, one that can completely change how you see your past, between being emotionally deep and being emotionally unguarded. For a long time, you may have mistaken your intensity for a flaw. You may have tried to tone yourself down, shrink your reactions, and make your emotional world less visible, just to fit into environments that were never built to hold something as real as you. But your sensitivity was never the problem. It was never a weakness. It was awareness. It was perception. It was your ability to feel, read, and understand things that others miss completely. In the right conditions, it becomes insight. In the wrong ones, without protection, it becomes exhaustion. The real issue was the absence of boundaries. You didn't just open up to people. You gave them unrestricted access to your emotional world, your patience, your forgiveness, and your understanding, often without receiving even the most basic level of respect in return. And if you're honest, you weren't unaware of what was happening. You saw it. The inconsistency, the subtle disrespect, the repeated patterns that didn't align with their words. But you chose hope over evidence. You kept trying to interpret their behavior in a better light, as if understanding them deeply enough would eventually change how they treated you. You told yourself that if you explained yourself more clearly, if you stayed calmer, if you loved a little longer, things would eventually shift. But what actually happened was different. People didn't stay because they valued your presence. They stayed because your patience absorbed consequences they should have faced. You became the buffer between their behavior and reality. The Sophia Stage begins the moment that pattern breaks. It is the moment you stop being a landing place for other people's chaos and start becoming a protected space for your own peace. It removes the deep-rooted fear of being alone and replaces it with something far more grounded, the understanding that losing yourself inside a relationship is a much higher cost than solitude ever could be. You start to realize something that changes everything. Being alone in silence is lighter than sitting in a room where you are constantly misunderstood, dismissed, or emotionally overlooked. Loneliness is temporary, but being repeatedly disrespected slowly erodes your sense of self. Once that clarity sets in, you stop performing. You stop arguing to prove your value. You stop explaining why you deserve basic respect. Because at some point, you understand a hard truth. If your worth has to be constantly defended, it isn't being honored in the first place. Instead of asking, you begin to act. Instead of requesting boundaries, you start living them. And this shift doesn't need announcements or explanations. It's visible through behavior alone. Naturally, this version of you unsettles people who benefited from the older version. The version that always replied, always forgave quickly, always made things easier even when it cost personal peace. When you stop overextending yourself, the labels start changing. You become distant. You become selfish. You become different. But those reactions are not about who you are becoming. They are about what others are losing access to. And you have to allow that discomfort to exist without trying to fix it, because those reactions are often just attempts to pull you back into a version of yourself that was easier for others to manage. but harder for you to live inside. Anyone who only valued your presence when you had no boundaries will naturally resist the moment you develop them. Their frustration is not your responsibility. It is simply the consequence of losing access to someone they never had to respect in the first place. At this stage, your only responsibility is alignment with your intuition, your standards, and your internal sense of peace. Nothing external gets priority over that anymore. And this leads to a final realization that is uncomfortable but necessary. Predictability lowers respect. When people are fully certain that your forgiveness is guaranteed, your emotional reactions become something they can calculate instead of something they value. If they know you will always return, always soften, always stay regardless of behavior, there is no incentive for them to change how they treat you. You become dependable in the wrong way, not valued, but assumed. The Sophia stage is where that cycle ends. In the world of human behavior, something always becomes clear over time. Anything that is guaranteed is rarely valued. It gets consumed, taken for granted, and eventually overlooked. The Sophia stage forces you to confront this reality without distortion. It teaches you that access to your inner world is not an automatic right for others. It is a responsibility they must continuously prove they can handle. You begin to notice a pattern that can feel unsettling at first. Some of the people you once believed were deeply connected to you don't actually respond to your absence the way you expected. It turns out they were never attached to your essence as a person. They were attached to your presence in their life, your availability, your responsiveness, your willingness to step in, fix, listen, support, and absorb. What they miss is not your heart. It is your function in their life. When you stop overfunctioning, when you stop playing the role of two people in a dynamic that was only meant for one, you begin to see the relationship for what it actually is. It's similar to draining water from a lake only to discover what was hidden underneath the surface the entire time. If a connection collapses the moment you stop carrying it emotionally, then it was never a shared bond. It was a one-sided structure supported entirely by your effort. At that point, you have to develop the courage to accept what falls apart. If something only existed because you were overextending yourself, then it wasn't mutual. It was maintenance you were performing alone. This is also where clarity replaces illusion. You stop dressing inconsistency in romantic language. Inconsistency is not mystery. It is not depth. It is information. It reflects either a lack of genuine interest or a lack of integrity. And once you see it clearly, you stop chasing explanations from people who benefit from remaining unclear. If someone truly values you, their actions don't require decoding, and if they truly intend to stay, they don't repeatedly drift away. In the Sophia stage, your mindset shifts completely. You are no longer trying to solve people like puzzles or decode their contradictions like a detective. You step into the position of observation and evaluation. You simply look at behavior as evidence, and you allow that evidence to speak for itself. There is no need to argue with patterns that already reveal their conclusion. This is where real control begins, not external control over others, but internal control over yourself. True strength is not in reaction, but in restraint. Before this shift, your nervous system may have been constantly involved in every interaction you experienced. Small changes in tone, delayed replies, or subtle shifts in attention could trigger internal spirals of overthinking. You lived in a reactive state, constantly trying to repair, clarify, or stabilize situations the moment emotional discomfort appeared. But something changes in this stage. A gap forms between stimulus and response. And in that gap, you regain authority over your internal world. You start separating emotional memory from present reality. You begin to ask yourself a simple but powerful question. Is this actually happening now, or is this an old emotional pattern being reactivated? That distinction becomes life-changing. Because now you are no longer reacting to relieve discomfort, you are choosing whether reaction is even necessary. And more often than not, you realize that protecting your peace is more valuable than winning an emotional exchange that was never meaningful in the first place. Silence becomes intentional. Observation becomes active. You allow people to speak fully without interruption. You stop rushing to correct every misleading statement or explain every misunderstanding. And in doing so, something interesting happens. People reveal more than they intended to. Their contradictions surface naturally. Their patterns become visible without effort on your part. You realize you don't need to expose anyone. Time and behavior do that work on their own. At this level of awareness, you also begin to understand something deeper about emotional expression. Not every feeling requires immediate release. Not every thought deserves an audience. You were once conditioned to believe that authenticity meant instant expression, that whatever you felt needed to be spoken right away. But the Sophia Stage reframes that entirely. Impulsivity is not truth. It is often unprocessed emotion seeking discharge. Real emotional maturity involves pausing, regulating, and understanding before responding. You process internally first, and only then decide whether expression serves any meaningful purpose at all. And often the most powerful response is no response. Not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. This leads into a final and defining shift: selective access. There is a misconception that this stage turns you cold or detached. That is not what actually happens. You do not stop feeling. You do not lose empathy. You do not become emotionally absent. Instead, you become precise. Your emotional world remains intact, but your access to others becomes intentional. You are no longer available by default. You are no longer open to everyone who enters your life casually. You begin to understand that your emotional energy, your attention, and your presence are valuable resources, not something to be distributed without discernment. And with that realization, self-respect becomes non-negotiable. You reach a point where you refuse to continue investing in people who would not invest in you even at a fraction of the same intensity. You stop offering emotional depth to those who only operate at surface level when it comes to you. The question guiding your life changes entirely. Instead of asking how to maintain someone's presence in your world, you begin asking something far more important. Does this person actually deserve access to me? That question becomes a filter. And through that filter, your relationships begin to reorganize themselves naturally. What is aligned stays. What is one-sided fades. What is inconsistent loses relevance. And what is genuine becomes unmistakable. The most powerful part of this transformation is that it unfolds without announcement. There is no need to declare a new identity, no need to broadcast your evolution, and no desire to explain your internal shift to people who never understood you in the first place. It happens quietly, almost invisibly from the outside, but completely unmistakable from within. You don't send messages about your new era. You don't write emotional statements to people from your past to prove how much you've changed. You don't warn anyone that your boundaries are different now. You simply begin to behave differently. You take longer to respond. You speak with more intention and less urgency. You stop overextending yourself for people who have never once extended themselves for you. And without making it a performance, you begin to withdraw from dynamics that required you to abandon yourself just to maintain them. When this change happens in silence, something important occurs. You remove the audience from your growth. And without an audience, there is no room for interference. No one can argue you out of your self-respect when they are no longer invited into your decision-making process. At some point, a difficult realization becomes unavoidable. If you continue returning to the same patterns after clearly seeing their cost, it is no longer just about other people's behavior. It becomes about your continued access to it. Not as blame, but as awareness. You are the gatekeeper of your own life, and what you allow repeatedly eventually becomes part of your identity. This is where your relationship with yourself begins to shift. You stop seeing boundaries as aggression and start seeing them as responsibility. You are no longer being difficult or cold. You are becoming deliberate. You are no longer trying to be universally accessible. You are learning to be internally protected. Choosing carefully who gets emotional access to you is not an act of rejection, it is an act of preservation. You are no longer scattering your energy in every direction. You are learning how to contain it, direct it, and respect it. This is the final stage of transformation. Not becoming someone new, but finally becoming fully aligned with yourself. For most of your life, you may have operated as an expert in other people's emotional worlds. You learned how to read moods, interpret pain, decode silence, and understand behavior that others couldn't explain. You became highly capable at holding space, absorbing tension, and making sense of chaos that wasn't even yours to carry. You were the one who stayed when things became complicated. The one who tried harder when others withdrew. The one who prioritized connection over personal limits, repeatedly choosing us even when us required the loss of you. And in doing so, you developed a strong identity around loyalty, endurance, and emotional responsibility. But somewhere in that process, your loyalty to others began to outweigh your loyalty to yourself. Now that pattern begins to reverse. All the energy you once used to understand, fix, and accommodate other people begins to turn inward. Not in self-absorption, but in self-realignment. You start asking questions you previously avoided. What do I actually need? What am I tolerating? What have I been excusing in the name of understanding others? And slowly, the focus shifts from proving how much you can endure to recognizing how much you no longer need to tolerate. A truth becomes unavoidable at this stage. Real growth comes with loss. Not because growth is destructive, but because it changes your compatibility with environments that were built around your former self. The version of you that had no boundaries was easier for certain people to access, influence, and rely on. The version of you that now has standards is no longer that easy to reach, and that creates distance. You stop prioritizing history over alignment. Time alone no longer qualifies someone for continued access to you. Years spent together no longer justify ongoing disrespect. Familiarity stops being enough to override emotional truth. If something no longer aligns with your peace, your values, or your direction, you begin to release it without needing to justify that decision endlessly. Not because explanations are wrong, but because you no longer owe access to people who have already demonstrated they don't handle it with care. If your silence makes others uncomfortable, you stop rushing to fix that discomfort. You understand that what they are reacting to is not your cruelty, it is the absence of your overfunctioning. And you are no longer responsible for making your self-respect easier for others to digest. Your role in life is not to be endlessly available, endlessly understanding, or endlessly accommodating. You are not here to function as emotional infrastructure for everyone around you. You are not a system designed for unlimited access. Your responsibility is simpler and more serious: to become unavailable for disrespect. That means you no longer negotiate your worth in environments that repeatedly overlook it. You stop extending chances to people who have already shown consistency in how they treat you. You stop confusing familiarity with safety. Over time, something inside you changes in response to disrespect. It stops triggering anger and starts triggering clarity. You no longer feel the need to explain every boundary in detail. You simply act on it. You remove access. You step back. You disengage without emotional collapse. And in doing so, you close the door on the version of yourself that constantly tried to fix, rescue, and stabilize relationships at the cost of your own internal balance. Every moment you ignored your own discomfort to preserve someone else's comfort was a quiet form of self-abandonment. Every time you stayed silent when you needed to speak, every time you said yes when everything in you was saying no, you were slowly eroding your own alignment. The Sophia Stage is where that internal conflict ends. You are no longer choosing between yourself and others. You are choosing yourself first, without apology and without negotiation. Not because you value others less, but because you finally value yourself equally. Your kindness is no longer automatic. It is intentional. Your empathy is no longer unrestricted. It is directed. Your presence is no longer assumed. It is earned. You have already mastered the art of showing up for others. Now you are learning the more difficult, more powerful art of showing up for yourself. And that is not just growth.